I'm delighted to have with me today Dawn Lester and David Parker, authors of the book What Really Makes You Ill, Why Everything You Thought You Knew About Disease is Wrong. Dawn and David, the book you've written is just under 800 pages long and took over 10 years of extensive research to publish in December 2019. The book aims to answer the question of why people become sick. I'd like to point out that neither of you are medical doctors and have no connection to the medical establishment. You've written a fantastic and eye-opening book examining the evidence that has led you both to conclude that there are flaws within the information about illness and disease that has been promulgated by the medical establishment. Could you tell us a little about your respective backgrounds and what persuaded you to write the book?
For those that don't know us, Dawn and I have worked together for about 20 years. My background, before I started writing things, I'm an electrical engineer. Dawn, I'm sure doesn't mind me saying, was an accountant. But obviously we don't do that anymore, mainly because we don't have time. And I'm way past the retiring age, so I'm retired from engineering. But Dawn and I, as I say, got together about 20 years ago, and we found we had common interests in things like the nature of reality. That was our first passion, if you like. And so the very first book we wrote is called The Nature of Reality. And this is going back about 17 years now. And so we, at that time, 17 years ago, we believed what most of the world still believes, and that is that germs make you ill, either bacteria or viruses mostly, that vaccinations were good for you and could prevent these diseases, and that the medical system was based on solid science and that doctors knew what they were doing. That's what we believed 17 years ago. But while we were writing our book about the nature of reality, under our pen name then, NOR, because mainly me, because I was employed by a very large international company, which would not have taken too kindly to some of the things that we said in the book. So we wrote under our pen name. You can still get it, still on Amazon. It was while we were writing that book, there was a chapter in it about health, and in particular about viruses. And at that time, we realised we didn't know very much about viruses, so we started to investigate. And that opened up the tin of worms, as they say, and we realised there was something very wrong with everything that we'd thought we knew. And the very first so-called disease that we happened to come across, although we've realised that there's nothing by chance anymore, everything has a purpose, was HIV/AIDS and the story of HIV/AIDS. And that was the very first so-called disease that we started to investigate. And keeping a long story short, because it's all in the book, we realised that there were two main camps. There was one camp of doctors and scientists that said there's no virus that causes this illness, and another camp, a bigger camp, that said there was. And at that time, Carrie Mullis was around, no longer with us unfortunately, but people will know him as the inventor of the PCR process, from which the PCR test was developed. And he, at the time, this is going back into the 80s now, was looking for some papers to reference in some other work that he was doing. And he was looking for the scientific papers that showed that what the virus was that was supposed to cause AIDS, because there should be scientific work that shows that the viral particle has been fully isolated, purified, genetically characterised and proved to cause whatever the disease is. And that should all be written down in a proper peer-reviewed scientific paper. And he found that that paper did not exist anywhere. No one had written it up, even though it was being touted as if it had, and it was all official. So that was very odd, and he thought there's something very wrong here. And we'd found the same thing, that there was no scientific papers to prove there was a virus that caused AIDS. And so that was the start of it. And as we investigated, again, cut a long story short, we found that sure enough there was no virus causing AIDS. This whole syndrome, if you like, this set of symptoms, which were supposed to have started with homosexual men in San Francisco, and we found that actually this relatively small group of men were sort of heavy recreational drug users, and their main drug of choice was what was colloquially known as poppers, which is actually amyl nitrite, which is very toxic, although it gives a high and relaxes people. And they were using it regularly, every day, because it's very toxic, it was making them ill. So then they were going to their doctors, and the doctors were prescribing them with antibiotics, high-dose antibiotics. So instead of getting better, they got even worse. So the doctors, in their wisdom, decided to try some other drugs on them, one of which was AZT, which was a chemotherapy drug in actual fact, which had been taken off the market because it was so toxic. So you'd think, what wisdom would say, well, let's give this to people? And that's what they did. And we know from talking to doctors at the time that that dose of AZT killed everybody. Everyone who took that level of AZT died. And famous people like Freddie Mercury and Arthur Ashe and Rudolf Nureyev and Rock Hudson, people who know these, and lots of ordinary people as well, of course. But it killed everyone. But of course it was easy to just blame AIDS, which is exactly what the medical establishment did, even though they had no proof for this virus being the cause of it, but lots of proof to show that it was the drugs, it was the treatment that was killing people. So that was the start of it for us. As I say, I remember to this day, Dawn and I saying, blimey, if they got this one so wrong, what else have they got wrong? And that was the start of a 10-year research programme into all the main diseases that people are most familiar with, where we were trying to find out, hence the title of the book, what really makes people ill. And then the second part, which we found, was why everything you thought you knew about disease is wrong, because that's exactly the situation we were in. And all the diseases that we looked at, well, illnesses as we prefer to call them, all had a very logical reason as to why people got ill, and none of them were to do with germs. And as we say in the book, we boiled down to what we call our 4 factors as to why people get ill. So that was the start of it. We knew, because although we came from very different backgrounds, I mean, I did come from a technical background, being an electrical engineer, but Dawn as an accountant, we both had logical minds, or still have logical minds, and so we're used to dealing with detail, we're used to studying, and we're used to being very precise. I often joke that, if I got it wrong electrically, someone dies, they get electrocuted, and if Dawn gets it wrong with her numbers, then the company goes out of business. So we have to be precise. So that wasn't a stranger to us. And we applied that logic to studying the medical system. And we looked into every nook and cranny. That's why it took 10 years, because we knew we'd got to get everything right. And that's why there's 40 pages of references at the back of the book that shows the sources of our material. We tried as much as possible to use what people will feel safe with. So it's all reports from other doctors throughout the ages of the last 150 years, even using papers from the WHO, World Health Organization, so that, we can show that officialdom contradicts itself and cannot prove what it says it can prove. They have no scientific proof whatsoever. So this is the theme throughout the book, and that's why it's nearly 800 pages. So that was the start of it, really. We thought, well, how can it have got so wrong? And I mean, the sort of allopathic system has been going for roughly 150 years. And we thought, well, how can it have been so wrong and still continuing to be so wrong? So we went right back to square one and looked at the origins of the germ theory, which is either bacteria or viruses, caused this illness. And we found that in the early days, this is going back about 150 years, when the pioneers in the field of medicine, if you like, only had optical microscopes. And so when they looked into a sample of blood, let's say, from a sick person, at that time thought that the blood was sterile. So when they saw what we know as bacteria in the blood, they assumed that the body must have been attacked by these things. They are living microorganisms. And so they thought the body must have been attacked by it. And when they could see bacteria surrounding dead and dying tissue, they were then convinced, they're obviously attacking the body and we can see it. They didn't realise that the body is always full of bacteria, both in it and on it, vital to the body. Without them, there would be no life. And that they're the clean-up mechanism. In simple terms, they're the clean-up mechanism, because as cells die, which they do in their hundreds of thousands every day, natural process, the bacteria clean them up, like they do out in the forests with dying trees and leaves. They break it down and it returns back to the earth. And in the body, they break down the dead and dying tissue so that the body can flush it out. This is their process. We need them for even digestion. We wouldn't be able to digest our food if we didn't have loads of bacteria in our gut. So they're not the body's enemy, they're the body's essential friend. But they didn't know this, and they thought they were attacking the body. They also knew that they couldn't blame all the diseases on bacteria, so they knew there must be something else. But it wasn't until the 1930s, when the electron microscope was invented, that they could see smaller bits and pieces, and they could see these other specks, and they assumed that these were other killers, if you like, other infectious agents. And they gave them the name viruses. But as we often tell people, the word virus comes from the Latin, and its original meaning was poison or noxious substance, which is much truer. It's nothing to do with particles, which is what they place this name on. But then and now, they have still never proven that these particles actually do anything. Nor would they, when you consider that they're just cellular debris. That's actually what they are. Cellular debris. They've never been living things, unlike bacteria, which are living things. This cellular debris is just the residue of cells as they break down. But they were ignorant of this fact. Over the years, of course, has been very convenient for the burgeoning pharmaceutical industry to latch onto this and decide that they can produce medicines that people can take to kill these invaders, whether it's bacteria or viruses. And particularly in the case of viruses, that pharmaceutical industries can produce vaccines which can give you immunity against these particles. Now, that comes on to another major stumbling block that we came across, which is the fact that the body doesn't have an immune system. That's not how the body works, and this is always a great surprise to people. They think, well, everyone talks about the immune system, but what the body actually has, when we studied it, is that it has what we would prefer to call a maintenance and repair system. The body is brilliant at looking after itself, and it has all the facilities to do that. Why would it need an immune system against germs when the body knows perfectly well it's not germs that attack the body? Bacteria are necessary for the body, and viruses are non-living bits of debris. So why would it need an immune system to protect it? But this myth has to be, well, first of all, perpetrated and then prolonged by the pharmaceutical industries, because the vaccine industry depends on it. If you think about it, the vaccine industry depends on this myth that the body has an immune system which they can then inject you with something, which then gets the body to produce this other mythical thing called antibodies, which are supposed to be specific to the germ, so that these antibodies then, once they're induced by the vaccine, circulate around in your body for years maybe, until it's eventually attacked by this mythical virus, and then it will swoop in and destroy it. That's basically, in a nutshell, what it is. So once you take away the myth of the immune system, then people will say, well, why do we need vaccines? Because they can't produce an immune response, because the body doesn't work like that. And it doesn't. So these things of antibodies are complete myths. They've never been shown to exist. The body does produce proteins, things like globulins, which is part of the repair mechanism. It's the sort of thing that would, if you cut your leg, would form a scab. They're like little glue sticky proteins called globulins, or repair cells. So it does that, but these are non-specific. They're not antibodies, as the medical establishment would have us believe. So that's just another one of these medical myths, but quite an important one, because you can see why the fallacy of the germ theory and antibodies and immune system all tie together and are prolonged by the pharmaceutical companies and doctors. So we thought, well, how can this be? So we thought, well, we're going to have to look at how doctors are educated, because we couldn't accept that doctors were all evil people and that they knew perfectly well that all this was mythology. Well, we thought that can't be true. So we looked at how they were educated. We talked to doctors, like Dr. Andy Kaufman, about how they're educated at medical school. Again, cut a long story short, it became obvious to us that when doctors go along to medical school, they're like all of us. When we go to school, we're taught in our early years of education, we're taught that germs exist. Don't sneeze or use a handkerchief and wash your hands, all of these things. We're taught all this from very early on, 5, 6 years old. And our parents would take us along to be vaccinated, against these germs to make sure that we're not going to, so it's all instilled into us. We never think to question it, and our parents never thought to question it. Not so now, of course, more people are questioning it. But back in the day, certainly in my day anyway, I go back a long time, that was all accepted. Doctors were almost godlike. But of course, doctors of today all start in the same sort of state education systems, and they're all taught the same things. And then as they grow up and pass exams and want to be trained as a doctor, when they start at medical school, they've just got this basic grounding that germs exist and vaccinations are good for you and all the rest of it. And that's continued in their education, as we found. Their medical school, they're indoctrinated further. They are told that, this bacteria causes that disease, this virus causes that disease, and these are the drugs that you administer. They never get to do any research at medical school. They just have to soak up all this information and answer the questions come exam time. They have to answer the questions in line with what they've been taught. And we found that most of the medical colleges were owned either partly or wholly by the pharmaceutical companies. We found that the curriculums were largely set by the pharmaceutical companies. We found that the college libraries were stocked by the pharmaceutical companies, and that most of the lecturers were employed by the pharmaceutical companies. So you can see where the problems start. Hardly surprising. So doctors are just doing what they've been indoctrinated to do. Through no research, we found that most doctors didn't even know what the contents of vaccines were. They didn't know about the things which are called adjuvants, which are these additives that are put in, things like aluminium and formaldehyde and all sorts of mercury, on the basis that they're supposed to produce a reaction in the body. Well, they most certainly will. If you inject poisons into the body, you'll get a reaction. But doctors weren't aware of the contents, which is really surprising. They knew next to nothing about nutrition. The doctors we talked to said that throughout their 5 or 6 years at college, they might get an hour or two to be taught about nutrition, which is vital, as we'll say later in this conversation. So they were basically trained to become drug pushers for the pharmaceutical companies. And that may sound harsh, but that's basically what happens through no fault of their own. And of course, the doctors that we've talked to that have now withdrawn from the medical establishment because they realise the errors of their ways, if you like, they've realised that instead of being able to follow their Hippocratic oath of first do no harm, that they were actually causing harm, and in many cases realised they were actually causing the deaths of the patients they were trying to help. And obviously that is a very bitter pill, forgive the pun, for doctors to have to swallow, to realise that they're actually harming and killing people. No one can live with that for very long. And so more and more doctors are coming out of the medical establishment or speaking out. But of course, as soon as they speak out, they end up having their medical certificate taken from them so that they can no longer practice, which gives them obviously great trouble to support their families. And this is the way it works, censorship and all the rest of it, which all of us suffer from, because the establishment, in all its forms, does not want the truth, because the pharmaceutical companies, as we know, are hugely rich. They make literally billions every year out of peddling drugs, which includes vaccines. And it's all based on the germ theory. Take the germ theory away, and the whole of the pharmaceutical company business actually collapses, because what is it for? So they go to great trouble to shut anyone down that wants to speak the truth, including doctors. They have, through their monetary systems, control of the mainstream media. That's why, if people think about it, why there's no open debates in the media anywhere, newspapers, television, radio, about that there could even be an alternative view to the germ theory. You never see it, ever. Now there's a reason for that, and why even now people are censored on Facebook, just ordinary people wanting to talk to one another, or YouTube, ordinary people wanting to talk to one another about their views. And if you put anything up, we know because we've suffered from this too, that contradicts the mainstream view, it's just deleted. Now, that's not a democracy, that's a tyranny. And once free speech disappears, which it has in the Western world, probably the whole world, then we're living in a tyranny. That's where we are.
When you conducted your research into the available evidence for the causes of illness and disease, I imagine you came across plenty of literature that claimed to substantiate the medical establishment's version of why people become sick. What was it about the alleged evidence claiming to back medical science that you found was flawed in comparison to the additional body of information you discovered which offered alternative reasons for why people become sick?
You're quite right. There's lots of claims. Even now, people can get inundated with papers claiming to have proved, if we just take the COVID virus thing, claiming to have fully isolated the virus and proved that it causes COVID. But when you examine those papers, and we have, and so has people like Dr. Stefan Lanka and Dr. Andy Kaufman, Dr. Tom Cowan, and all the other doctors, they've examined these papers too. And even though in the abstract, the usual relatively small paragraph at the beginning of one of these so-called scientific papers, because they're not, it may claim to have done all those things. But when you read the methodology, you find that they have not done those things at all. And even the paper that got published in the journal Nature, which is supposed to be the most prestigious scientific journal in the world, again, it's exactly the same story. And that particular paper, Dr. Andy Kaufman took apart publicly and published the findings on the internet, I'm pleased to say, which showed it was completely fraudulent, even admitted so at the end of the paper that they'd not actually fully isolated and purified the virus, they had not genetically characterised it, they had not met Koch's postulates, and they had not proved that it caused COVID. They actually admitted it at the end of the paper, which was in complete contradiction to what they said in the abstract at the beginning. Now that's pure fraud, and really it should never have been published, and it just shows the lengths that the establishment, right up to the level of a journal like Nature, it shows the lengths they're prepared to go to deceive doctors, because doctors tend to only read the abstract, they don't read the full methodology, and certainly the general public, who probably never even read the papers at all. It just shows, though, how critical it is to them not to let the truth get out, and they're prepared to lie in the extreme to deceive the public. Now, to me, that's criminal. There's no two ways about it. That is criminal behaviour. So you have to ask, what is their game when they're prepared to do that? Well, we know what the game is, but that will take quite a long time to explain. But there is a programme from on high, shall we say. This is by very powerful groups that sit behind governments. They even sit and infiltrate the World Health Organization. I can mention groups like people may not have heard of even, like the Committee of 300, the Club of Rome, and the Tavistock Institute, which people may have heard of that one. And these are very powerful groups, and they have their tentacles, for want of a better word, into all of these organisations, which includes the World Health Organization. And they are the ones that are pulling the strings, and they are the ones that have coordinated this fake pandemic with a view to changing the world situation. We've heard people like Klaus Schwab talk about the Great Reset that's coming. Well, we obviously have to prevent that, because it's designed to take full control of the world, to have a one world government, unelected by us, of course, the people, and more importantly, full control of the people, which is something they've never had. They control all the resources, oil and gas and electricity, but they've never been able to control all the people effectively so far, because people are quite unpredictable, aren't they? Like us, for instance. We're quite unpredictable, we're very difficult, it's like trying to herd cats when you try to get everyone to agree to the same thing. So they're trying these more devious methods to either kill people off or dehumanise them, or reduce them to sickly beings that can't really think for themselves. And the drugs, including vaccinations, have been responsible for that. If people look into it, they'll realise there's a thing called iatrogenesis, which is basically death by modern medicine. That's really what it means. And we know, looking at the figures in the United States alone, there's at least 200,000 people a year die from iatrogenesis, i.e., and this is not malpractice, this is where doctors have prescribed drugs and the patient has taken the drugs as prescribed and it's killed them. And this is what iatrogenesis is. And when there's hundreds of thousands of people, and that's just in America, but this happens wherever Western medicine is performed, so throughout the Western world certainly. So there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people die every year who are killed by their doctors. And this is such a scandal that you'd think the news media would publish it, but they don't.